Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. The Philogelos is a joke book written in Greek and compiled sometime in the 4th century CE. The jokes in it are terrible. To call them dad jokes would be unfair to dads. But I want to start today with one of them. Here it goes. Someone went to a charlatan prophet to ask if his rival, who was away on a voyage, would return. The prophet looked at the omens and promised he will never return. But a few days later, the man saw his rival walking down the street. He went back to the prophet to complain. The prophet simply sighed and said, "My, how shameless some people can be." That joke, like I said, is not funny. But here, I'm not interested in the punchline. Rather, I'm interested in what the joke takes for granted. We aren't told if this prophet is a pagan priest, a Jewish wonder worker, or a Christian holy man. The joke presumes an ecumenical, quotidian culture, one in which everyone is competing for a piece of the supernatural marketplace. This shared religious landscape is a subject that Michael Satlow, my guest for this episode, explores in his new book, The Enchanted World of Late Antiquity. For Michael, the religion of the average person wasn't defined by the rigid boundaries of the church, the synagogue, or some sort of Greek temple culture, but by a shared belief in a world humming with invisible beings and forces. Whether you saw yourself as a Christian, Jew, or pagan, you bought the same amulets and curses, consulted the same dream interpreters, and feared the same boogeymen and ghosts. But while this shared spiritual culture might have been the norm for the person on the street, it was a source of deep anxiety for the era's intellectuals. In his book, Michael distinguishes between lived religion, the practical, sometimes chaotic, and often shared ways that people interacted with the divine, and the more rarefied efforts of intellectuals, bishops, rabbis, and philosophers, who are busy creating religious identities in large part by building fences between them. Late antiquity saw these elites working to codify religious laws specifically designed to create difference, sometimes where little actually existed. But as ever, the work that was going on in the ivory tower didn't reflect or immediately change what was actually happening in the stalls of the marketplace. This is the second episode of Lesche this season to feature the concept of enchantment. Lesche Season 2, Episode 31 with Tatiana Burr is called Enchantment Technologies of Greek Religion. The world does not feel like a very enchanted place right now. But work like Michael and Tatiana's is helping to remind me of some of the magic that it does hold, and giving me some hope that one day, when our hearts are less heavy, we'll be able to feel it again. Michael Satlow is professor of Judaic studies and religious studies at Brown University, a historian of religion in antiquity. His work explores how Jews, Christians, and others experience the sacred in everyday life. His new book, An Enchanted World, draws on inscriptions and material culture to reveal a shared religious landscape in late antiquity, one filled with gods, angels, demons, and divine presence. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. Remember, too, that Lesche is on Instagram at Lesche Podcast. That's where I post announcements about new episodes. So if you're on Instagram, you might want to follow us there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Michael Satlow. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
The book was a long time in the making. So from the time that I actually got into the field, I've always had this interest in social history. And I don't mean social history in kind of a Marxist or a class way so much as what people really were doing in antiquity. And being able to get into their heads a bit and to learn something about the past and also about the present, because I always find people in different times and places, they think differently about things, and I can always learn something from that. So I started out working in issues of sexuality and marriage and gender, and since then things moved along until I became involved in a group run out of the Max Weber University on lived religion in antiquity. And that kind of helped me to think through and coalesce some of my interests in this book project. The problem with the book project, and this I think gets at the heart of one of the things I was trying to get at, is in antiquity, everything is religion, or everything has some connection to what we would call religion. Because the category of religion as something distinct hasn't fully coalesced. Parts of it, I think, were in the air. But religion, really as we understand it, only comes into being as a counterpoint to the secular, which really comes from John Locke. So in order to carve out space for the secular, you need to limit the religious. So you create religion, and religion becomes that which is controlled by ecclesiastical authorities. Religion as a category is really, in a sense, all about power, and always has been. But people's lived experience in antiquity, and for many people today too, it's not you can't just disembed it and take it out of the normal interaction of everyday life, because everything involves, to some extent, some need or anxiety or issue that involves the supernatural beings. So once you begin to think about that, you think, how do you write something about lived religion that isn't about everything? And that was a real challenge of the book. And I think in a sense that is what I was trying to grapple with and get around to describe some of the contours of lived religion in antiquity and how we might think about it within this much wider context.
In the introduction to the book, you are careful to make the distinction for the reader, and I think this is really helpful, between lived religion and popular religion. Could you just give an overview of the difference between those terms?
Yeah, a lot of it just comes with what we associate with these things. So neither one is precise. Neither one is a good, precise analytical category. I think when we think about popular religion is a term that has been popularized by people who think about it in contrast to official religion or proper religion. So there's the religion that the authorities say you should do, and then there's the stuff that they don't really like that people are doing within their congregations and communities that's sometimes called popular. So therefore, popular often gets either degraded or it gets valorized in some way. But it's not really an accurate depiction, I think, of what really happens on the ground. Is that people aren't necessarily thinking about what they're doing in relationship to this kind of official articulation of it, but instead they're going about often traditional practices in their own ways, in the ways that their families and communities have always done them. So I wanted to at least get out of the association of popular religion. Another possible strategy would have been to try to redefine popular religion and then use it going forward. But this was, I think, an easier way to move past it. But either way, I think that the point is not to make those value judgments between like popular and official.
One of the things that you note is that a lot of times the kinds of phenomena that you're discussing have been filed under the category of something like folk religion, you might call it, or superstition or whatever. But you point out in the introduction that kind of approach misses something, and this is you writing here, that was absolutely central to the lives of most people in late antiquity, 200 to 600 of the Common Era, when both rabbinic Judaism and Christianity were in formation. And you write, most people thought that the world was thick with supernatural beings who were as real and had as much, if not more, agency as any person. Could you say a little bit about late antiquity, and you do a little bit of a historiography of the concept in the introduction, and how particularly it's that rubric is working for you as the kind of organizing periodization of the book?
Yeah, my interest really is this period of the beginning of the rabbinic period. So the rabbis come onto the scene in around the year 70, but our first surviving kind of extant literary evidence from them is the Mishnah and some of the biblical commentaries, the Midrashim, that we have are redacted about 200. So I'm interested in kind of some of the previous scholarship has been focused on what's called the Second Temple period, which ends in about the year 70 of the Common Era. How people were acting in contrast to the official productions or the official institutions of the temple. But I want to go past that and say, well, okay, you have the emergence of rabbis now. I'll get to the Christians in a second. But you have the emergence of these rabbis. So this is also from a Jewish historiographic perspective, which is often ignored, I think, when we look at the traditional scholarship being produced in late antiquity. And when you look at the late antiquity, so I'm beginning late antiquity around the time of the rabbis, and I'm loose about 200. I'll take it back a little bit earlier. Once in a while, I'll even go back to the Second Temple period or earlier just to illustrate certain things. But for me, this becomes important because a lot of the historiography in the rabbinic period or about the rabbis has been that the rabbis arose as religious leaders because there was a religious vacuum. And to me, that was always intuitively difficult to get my head around because often people don't look to religious leadership. In antiquity, not in antiquity, and not to today. So it's not as if leaders are gone, new people come on the scene, they say, we're going to be the new leaders, everybody says yay. So once you try to move past that, right, you're working within that historiographic tradition of seeing rabbis as the institutional leaders and leaders of the Jews, but they're not. And increasing evidence is showing that they had somewhat marginal impact in most of the communities in which they operated until relatively late. On the other hand, you have the Christians, and they're going through something that at first looks a little bit similar. You have the origin of institutionalization and the beginning of Christian authorities who are trying to really articulate what it means to be a Christian. But it's very different once you get into the early 4th century when Christianity begins to emerge as actually the religion of empire. And how that plays out, not only against kind of a Jewish background, but also against the Greek and Roman background of traditional deities and the like. So late antiquity, I think, is, for me, it helps to frame a conversation between kind of rabbis, bishops, Greeks, Romans, and all the people who are operating under these categories.
Yeah, I mean, I love some of your formulations of the topic of the book. You write, again, an introduction of a shared spiritual landscape in this period. And then you have, and I love this phrase, you write of a lost world that crackled with the energy of the supernatural. Could you just say a little bit here about that spiritual landscape, or what do you mean by the supernatural?
I think we have a world in which there are invisible beings. Invisible beings are all over. And they're present. They're almost as present, or maybe even are as present, or more present than people who you can see. These beings, we call them all kinds of things. And a lot of the categories that we use come out of institutional, ecclesiastical, rabbinic sources, right? These are intellectuals who are trying to understand who these beings are and how they relate to each other, and especially within Christian and Jewish intellectuals, how they can work under some quasi-monotheistic conception of the world. So they're gods, they're angels, they're demons, they're ghosts, they're spirits. All these things are out there. And people understand, I think, on some kind of intuitive and traditional level, that in order to get anything done in the world, it's best to have the right beings on your side. And it's best to keep away the wrong beings. That's everywhere and for everything. Every business deal, every love interest, every illness, any of it can be either torpedoed or enhanced by having the right relationships with the right beings. Right.
So in your third chapter where you write about the cosmic order, and you problematize this notion of a strict monotheistic approach to religion in this time period. You write about this kind of divine hierarchy where there's the boss at the top, God, of the monotheistic God, as we usually understand it. And then below that, you have, as you were saying, you have the angels and demons, and then below that, these other spirits. To what extent among different communities and members of different religions, was that framework shared?
I think it was widely shared. And I think that is the framework of empire too. And that certainly does connect. So if you have if you're thinking about, again, the non-supernatural world, you have some kind of complaint to make, you want to appeal to some kind of authority in the Roman world or within the Greek city within the Hellenistic world, you don't go straight to the top. Going straight to the top is really dangerous because you can really get your head chopped off doing that. So you try to find somebody on the hierarchy who is approachable enough, but also has enough juice to help you get what you want. And I think people really thought about the world that way in terms of these cosmic hierarchies. So you have to find the right being in that order to get your goals accomplished. At the same time, it helps, and this is an important part of my argument in the book, is that it's not simply about finding somebody in a directory or being in a directory and going and then making the appeal, and you have a relationship with this being. You develop that relationship over time and in a series of ways so that when you do go or need this being, they can be helpful, and that there's a mutuality that's involved in a certain relationalism to what we call religion.
So are people who are members of different religions, let's say somewhere in Asia Minor, let's say Sardis or something, do you think that they're imagining those spirits in pretty much the same ways as each other? Or what kind of spirits are populating this spiritual world?
I do. I think that they may have different names for some of the spirits, and they may at times think that, well, the spirit that you call this is actually the same as the spirit that I call that on that level. But that, I think, is less important for me than the idea that they're really imagining the world functioning in the same way. So, yeah, that the spirits they're about and they're real. And sometimes those spirits sometimes they're ghosts, sometimes they're angels, sometimes they're demons. People in antiquity, Jews, Christians, Greeks, Romans, everybody in antiquity put a great deal of thought into keeping the bad spirits away. And they went through a lot of effort to do so.
Is there a piece of evidence or an anecdote that you think maybe illustrates people's relationship with these sort of lower level spirits or ghosts pretty well?
I think a lot of the evidence that I enjoyed looking at for sure was the amulets, and especially there are curse and binding amulets. There are all kinds of amulets. And I begin the book with one as well. Somebody from, I think, the area of modern day Hungary who had an illness, and she was buried with the amulet that was supposed to protect her from the illness. So that raises all kinds of questions. I think behind all of these amulets, which are their curses, their blessings, there are all kinds of things that go into these things, and they cross over. So something that they will evoke spirits from different traditions, what we would call traditions, with seemingly no self-consciousness that could be a problem, although it clearly would have been a problem to some of the intellectuals like the rabbis and the bishops. So you have just a whole series of these objects and these little texts. And what I love about these texts is that behind every text, like behind every also stone inscription, there's a story. And to think through a little bit, to try to get into that world of kind of what generated the amulet, how was the amulet produced, which technocrats like scribes did you need, and how much did you pay them to do it, and how did you use these things?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that there's this whole economy of this on the ground as well. Well, you mentioned that sometimes these amulets or whatever evidence we have appeals to what perhaps today we would think of as elements of multiple different religions. And in the book, in the second chapter, you really ties the notion that there are these three distinct religious identities, Christian, pagan, and Jewish, in late antiquity. Could you say a little bit about why thinking so schematically about the period it might not be the most useful approach?
Yeah, this ended up being for me something that I came to in the middle of the book project. It's really thinking this through as an important part of my argument, which is to say that much of the scholarship in late antiquity has been about identity formation. And that, I think, often connects to the modern moment in which we often think ourselves about our identities and what constitutes an identity. Now, when you think about religious identity too, what does it mean to be an emerging Christian? What does it mean to be a rabbinic Jew at a time when that's just emerging? But I wanted to push back against that and to say that actually it's far more complicated, and I think we all understand this on some intuitive level. Our identities are important only in certain contexts. We activate our own identities, and in antiquity they did too. What it meant to be part of an ethnic group was important in some contexts, but it was pretty unimportant in most contexts. So to get by in the world, right, to put food on the table, to help out a sick child, these things don't often involve identity in antiquity. And I think that often they don't today as well. So once you begin to crack through the rhetoric, which is produced by the intellectuals who are trying to create identities, they are about identity formation in many respects, down to people's lived experiences. I think identity, or the importance of identity, really fades.
Well, maybe you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned a couple of times now the intellectuals, which are the subject of another chapter here. How are they working parallel or at odds with the more on the ground material that or spiritual activity that you're describing? What is the tension between these levels?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's again something that I've struggled with a bit, because I think that intellectuals, they emerge from the same world as everybody else. So lived religion also means the lived religion of the people who I'm calling intellectuals. Maybe the difference between intellectuals these are people who often, there is a class difference here, because these are people who are often, they're literate, and you had to be relatively, most of the time you had to have relative wealth to be able to have afforded, or the family to afford to have educated you. So you have some kind of education, you have some kind of wealth, some kind of ability to actually devote time to thinking, to the intellectual work that they're doing. And then, but they're coming out of the same world. And in coming out of the same world, what they seek to do is to make sense of it. They are systematizers, they're theorists, they're people who are looking at the data around them and the way people are thinking, and then trying to organize it in a way that makes sense for them and for whatever agenda it is that they end up pushing. So there's an interesting tension in terms of looking at the literature that comes out from the intellectuals. And almost all the literature we have is produced by this group of people, that the literature on the one hand kind of reflects what people are thinking, what people are doing, but at the same time, it's trying to make sense of it, to theorize it, and then to dictate it finally, to create some kind of frameworks for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior for the particular groups in which they're engaged.
Could you maybe give an example of a text or two coming out of this period that speaks to this phenomenon, to this effort, or also to forge these group religious identities?
Yeah, well, right. So let me give an example that kind of tries to put that together along with kind of what we were just talking about. So the example of charity. So there seems to have been at least a popular Jewish understanding, and I think this is also true in the Christian world too, that giving alms to the poor brings you reward of some kind of divine reward, something. Something is often on the ground. So, for example, you might think, if I'm going to give money to a poor person, I'm going to find a gem somewhere and I will become rich. Now, when both rabbis and Christian intellectuals build on that, with how they understand that and try to transform that into distinctively Jewish and Christian ways of giving. And those Jewish and Christian ways of giving mean don't just give alms to the poor. In fact, don't even primarily give alms to the poor. Give your charity to us. Give it to the rabbis. Give it to the bishops. And we will institute some kind of system for redistributing it and giving it out to the poor. Now, that's, on the one hand, it builds on traditional understandings and traditional practices. But on the other hand, it tries to appropriate it and to reuse it for their own purposes. And then to establish or reinforce greater identity. Because once you have, for example, if the rabbis are in charge of distributing charity, then they are naturally making an assertion on the ground about their own authority when the poor have to come to them for the charity distributions. That hits another issue, which is power, that did a work. Rabbis, bishops, anybody, priests, they can all say whatever they want. The question is whether anybody follows them.
So in this period of a lot of religious doctrine establishment, let's say, and theorizing amongst those more intellectual classes, you're arguing that this is happening in part as a way to carve out distinctions in the face of this common culture.
That's right. Absolutely.
To come back to these supernatural agents, which I think are going to interest draw a lot of people to this book, yours truly included. I thought it was interesting. In one chapter, you really focus on the different kinds of ways in which people, as you write, cultivate their relationships with these supernatural agents. You mentioned the amulets before, but could you give a little bit of an overview of those ways?
The verse I say is sacrifices, and that becomes the paradigmatic way of establishing a relationship with the deity, because that involves often a gift. And maybe the paradigmatic form here is animal sacrifice, where even if you're not actually doing an animal sacrifice, making an animal sacrifice, it becomes a paradigm or the exemplar of the kind of thing that you would give to the deity to have a good relationship with that deity. And again, this is not this kind of gift giving. It's a form of gift giving is meant to establish the relationships, not simply to ask for something on a one-off. A second strategy is prayer, right? Prayer, saying the right words at the right times. And that prayer can include often what we sometimes call magic or superstition. There are different amulets, all these things that I avoid using terms like magic and superstition because I see those as being intrinsically value-laden. But these are all verbal ways of appealing to the deity and to establish the relationships to that deity. A third is prognostication. So we often turn to the supernatural world, or those in antiquity often turn to the supernatural world, looking for some information about the future. And this can range from on an official level, and we have actually records of this dating way, way back, of kings and priests asking prognosticators, who are usually prophets, yet some forms of priests, and do they go to war? What kinds of official actions can they do? What are the gods telling them? But this goes all the way down the ladder to just common day folk and whether or not they should invest in a business venture or how it is that they should make decisions and conduct their own lives. And the fourth is contagion. And that's the idea that holiness is contagious, that there are ways that we can approach the divine that involve actual kind of material contagion. Again, contagion I'm not using in a negative way, but simply physically touching. So maybe the most vivid example of that would be the Christian understanding of saints and saints' bodies. People who are holy human beings who have died, and then touching that body or coming close to that body or touching something that the body has touched, right, brings a sense of closeness to the deities. And you have that kind of idea of contagion is, I think, very common in late antiquity and often common in many other groups and religious groups to this day.
Well, you also write about how amid these different strategies for interacting with the divine or having access to or even physical contact with the divine, that there popped up or there always was a set of people who became specialists in facilitating all of this. Could you speak a little bit about that particular aspect of the cultural landscape of late antiquity?
Sure, because you need specialists, or sometimes the scholarship has called them ritual entrepreneurs. But there are always people in any kind of culture who help to ease some of the technical aspects of producing the kinds of things that you need to make these connections. So again, to be a little more concrete, for example, scribes. Scribes play a pretty big role in this kind of world. And that's because scribes have the expertise to write, also to read, and scribes may do this. I imagine them doing this on the side when they're not writing official rescripts or drafting letters or reading letters for other people. But they're creating amulets, they're creating all kinds of written artifacts that are useful in communicating with the divine world. There are a whole class of dream interpreters. Dreams are ways in which the supernatural world is understood to communicate to human beings. Jews, Christians, Greeks, Romans, we have lots of evidence of these floating dream interpreters that people would go to, give a coin to, and try to understand whether their dream was meaningful or it was just a dream. And if it was meaningful, what message it was sending them and how they could act on it.
Right. And so how were these people functioning, I guess, then in relationship to maybe more priestly classes or the intellectual classes? I mean, was there a strong partition between these aspects of what today we might call religious life, or how porous was this?
It's probably pretty porous. So, the evidence that we have is pointing to things like you could serve as a priest, but if you're a priest, you might or might not also be literate. And you might or might not then be able to also write amulets or to be a dream interpreter, right? Could you be a dream interpreter one day, but the next day go back to writing Christian tracts about something? And in fact, we have an example of that. So the categories can be pretty porous. There are those who would be, let's say, very much against all dream interpreters and dream interpretations. On the ends, or on the other end, there would be maybe a scribe who knows nothing about rabbis or bishops or any of this kind of intellectual formation that's going on. But there was also a lot of mixing in the middle.
So let's say, again, if we go back to Sardis or wherever in Asia Minor, and I'm a dream interpreter, at least professional or at least semi-professional, is it then likely that, quite possible, that my clients, the people who come to me, could be Jews, Christians, and pagans?
Yes. In fact, it's probably likely, especially if you're a good one. So if your dreams, if you get a reputation that your dream interpretation is effective, then you could probably cross over. And it also depends, of course, on your social groups and who has access to you. I mean, again, we imagine, let's say in Sardis, right? Sardis has this kind of big, opulent central area. And people are out there hawking their wares. And you come in and you're going to buy eggs, or you're selling a thing of vegetables. But you had a dream the other day, and you see some dream interpreters lined up trying to get business. And you try to figure out, well, which one do I go to? It's really hard to know exactly how you made that decision.
Without Yelp.
That's right. But, that would be word of mouth, of course. If your neighbor got something, your neighbor says, no, go to the fourth one dressed with the scarf over there, then maybe that's the one you go to and you get some kind of dream interpretation. And some are probably like today. There are people who might cloak themselves as having more authority, and those who would not have the same kind of education, perhaps, and not have access to the same kinds of dream interpretation manuals, which we know existed in antiquity, that you might go to and try to get your interpretation. And there was definitely a kind of a flow here. Same thing with scribes, right? You might think, well, I want to go, if I'm a Jew, I might want to go to a Jewish scribe, and the Jewish scribe will know all the Jewish beings. But as we've seen, that's not exactly happening, and we don't know the identity of the scribes in many of the cases, or whether they had a religious identity that was activated in the context of their professional work.
So these are maybe these kinds of moments and contexts and situations where, I mean, to go back to something you were saying earlier, what today we would think of as these strict demarcations of religious identity, that would have faded into the background. That wouldn't have been the primary driver of how people conduct their business or their lives.
That appears to be the case, yes.
Towards the last part of the book, in the last quarter of the book, you discuss sacred place and sacred time as they relate to this world. Maybe we could start with, could you give a bit of an overview of how you're understanding how sacred place is operative within the context that you describe here?
This gets back, I think, a little bit to the issue of contagion. So some places were often seen as more sacred or holy or had more access to supernatural beings than others. I think when you look at a place, there's an interesting evolution of sacred places often. Sacred places tend to be built on top of other sacred places, which tend often to connect to certain geological features of that place. So you might have some exceptional well or some spring that appears somewhere that would be unusual, and that might at some point become then seen as a sign. It's an eruption of the landscape, and we'll talk about that with sacred time too. Everything looks normal, except this thing isn't normal. This thing is out of place, and that out of place thing, like a dream, is often seen as something that is a message from the gods, or from the supernatural beings, and it is in some way venerated. Now we see there's a lot of building of kind of religious institutions on top of other religious institutions. So one of the most notable examples of this is when you have what's sometimes called pagan, traditional Greek and Roman temples that have been destroyed or abandoned, but then on top of them churches are built. Now that's odd. And that's often been seen, or at least some have seen it in terms of the historiography, as a sign of triumphalism, of kind of Christians now taking over from pagans. But probably something much more subtle is happening here. And that's that the temple, the original temple itself, is built on some location that's seen as inherently sacred. And often that is, if it's been abandoned or naturally just destroyed or by an earthquake, the church will build on it because people see the spot as sacred, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. So you have a good example of that kind of dynamic going on within sacred places. And it's important when you approach these supernatural beings, if you want to be in the right place, you want to be where they are. And this is an interesting tension with some of the intellectuals. The intellectuals who might look at, well, God, there's one God and God is everywhere. Well, yeah, but God seems to pay more attention to this place than that place, especially at this time or that time. And there's just this kind of thinking is really inherent and cuts across all religious boundaries.
Well, it's very interesting. It makes, this Hellenistic back to Homeric epic where you get the gods, they're always depicted as going off, they leave a scene and go off to a favorite place that they have, a favorite community, a favorite town or city where they particularly like to spend their off time.
Yeah, and I think it persists to the present. Again, and there's an interesting argument or case to be made here about thinking about what we might call lived religion in really a global and a way that transcends time and space, that people do tend to think about these dynamics in similar ways across cultures and times. Not identical, but similar. Trying to understand why that would be, I think, would be an interesting point of research.
Yeah, today in my field with students, you go back who go to Greece for the first time, they always come back with accounts of how spiritually moved they were by being just in Delphi, this idea of a place being inherently numinous. Do you have a favorite spot or a favorite example of where this happens?
Well, are you asking personally?
Yeah,
or
sure. Or one that you mentioned in the book, or both.
There's a famous well, right, where kind of Christians and Jews, and there'd be a lot of intermingling at this well. There's a lot of numinosity that occurs there, and you really see a mixing of communities in this location. I think personally, that's a much more difficult question for me, right? Because I think there are certain kinds of natural sites. You go to the Grand Canyon, right? And you kind of look at the Grand Canyon, you think like, oh my God, right? This is something that really is awesome. And you understand some of the ways in which the natural landscape can shape your understandings of the supernal world. There are certainly areas or sites for me, the area of the wall, the temple, the Western Wall, it's called today the Western Wall, right? I remember the first time I saw that, for me, was a kind of religiously inspiring site. So yeah, there are spots around that I think they're more evocative, perhaps, and that evocation might come from its natural associations, but it might also come from historical and cultural associations today.
Right, right. Well, so that's a little bit on sacred place, but then how do you then move into accounting for sacred time, and particularly the way that sacred time or time is organized in this period or punctuated by particular celebrations?
Yeah, so sacred time, I think, is in some ways a lot like sacred place, because when you look at what's unusual, time is such a difficult concept, right? You think about time, or what time looks like, or how we understand time, and time's this kind of continuum. But time is often, it's punctuated by, let's say, the rhythm of the day. And the rhythm of the day, often sunrise and sunset, are like dramatic moments that punctuate the day and that give you a different look or feel for the day. And those, in fact, unsurprisingly, become very important in the religious lives of late antiquity, as they become very important in the religious lives of many people, even up to the present day. So when it looks at there's a natural rhythm, or the rhythms of the moon, right? Turns out that you have many festivals on full moon days. So these are connected to these natural events. And so again, I think it operates a lot like sacred places as well.
Well, Michael, you conclude the book actually, and you gestured to this at the start of it, which some very moving reflections on the urgency or the kind of importance or significance of thinking about late antiquity in these terms today. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think to some extent the stories that we tell about the past, they create or they reify ways of thinking about the present. So especially when it comes to religion, when we think about religion as a story of identity and identity formation and identity conflict, because any kind of formation is about building boundaries and creating, there's a natural element of conflict in there. In a sense, we are reifying that and saying that is what religion is and maybe should be in the present. My attempt in the book, I think, as it emerged, and this is really an end product of my own thinking about how things worked in late antiquity, is to see that if you tell the story differently, it's not to deny that there wasn't identity was important at times, and there was identity formation, and there certainly was religious conflict all through late antiquity. But that's one side of a larger story. And if you just shift the focus of that, and don't deny that, but to focus on what actually united people in antiquity, this shared landscape of how they thought about the world, and really what's uniting them are their common, very human aspirations and fears, and that these issues of identity collapse under those kinds of much more important and human feelings, then maybe there's a way to rethink our own relationships to the story of religion. And when the story of religion really becomes more about what we have in common and our relationships, both to each other and to the world, as well as breaking apart these kinds of identity barriers that sometimes prevent us from seeing each other as fully human, maybe there's a lesson in there, as well as a lesson to the sacred. Again, without making any kind of claim, ontological claim about whether or not there is something sacred or there is a supernatural, seeing the world as enchanted, which is a term that comes out of Max Weber's Disenchantment, but as a world that is really full of potential, I think might open certain kinds of paths for our own ways of thinking and maybe our own well-being.
Well, I mean, for me, it was striking to think about how maybe scholarship's tendency to focus too much on the fine-grainedness of the differences of articulations of religious identity in this period, which are so prolific, is in a way to become susceptible to exactly what those intellectuals were trying to do, which was trying to carve out and divide, and it maybe misdirects a little bit from just how much there was in common. And so I think that your book also helps to provide this reframing for exactly what you were suggesting for thinking about today. I have to say that I think if there's ever a group of people or a place where the supernatural cuts across all identities, it's the paranormal subreddit. I think that's a place where you can find people of every religion, every kind of view. So maybe one place to start. Well, Michael, traditionally for this season of the podcast, I've been ending by asking guests, given how trying circumstances are these days, if there's anything that's been bringing you particular joy lately, whether it's something that you've been reading or listening to or watching or doing.
Yeah, so I think less the consuming media issue that I've been trying to do certain things. So I've been taking up skiing a bit and retaking up painting and working on spending more time with my family and really nurturing those relationships. That's what's bringing me joy right now.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for the book, the wonderful book, which I think that so many people across so many disciplines, antiquity and beyond, will be really interested in. And thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanna. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.